Hello and welcome to the Munich Security Conference, to our YouTube studio, and I'm very happy to welcome here in our studio Executive Director for Human Rights Watch, Mr. Kenneth Roth.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we're also happy having you here with us. Actually, I was thinking about the Munich Security Conference. I was a lot of world leaders, presidents, Minister of Defense, and then I saw Human Rights Watch.
Right.
And I asked myself, what is the Human Rights Watch doing here?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I've been coming to the Munich Security Conference for, I think, 15 years or something like that. And when I first came here, I was very lonely. There was nobody else dealing with human rights. Now, that's actually not the case anymore. I've got many colleagues here. But I think that the big topic here is Ukraine. And the importance of human rights, I think, are highlighted just by the whole Ukraine threat. Because if there were human rights in Russia, if there really was a free media, free civil society, competitive elections, and as a result, genuine debate about whether it's worth Russia invading Ukraine or not, I'd be surprised if the Russian people wanted to invade. But Putin, not only doesn't ask the Russian people, he's afraid of the Russian people. He just held an election where the whole point of the election was to prevent the Russian people from having any say whatsoever in who was going to rule them. And so it just demonstrates the close connection between human rights and the kind of classic security that's discussed here in Munich.
And you mentioned the Ukraine-Russian conflict. What's your main concern from the human rights point of view about this conflict? When we look at the last 3-4 days.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we have to recognize that while Putin talks about NATO, and as if this is all about, the threat that NATO poses, I mean, that's not a credible argument in the sense that NATO is not about to invade Russia. Ukraine is not about to join NATO. But
they want, but not yet.
It's nowhere on the agenda, as everybody keeps saying. I think, what is scary for Putin about Ukraine is Ukrainians' desire for democracy and their movement in that direction. It's not a perfect democracy, but it's much more of one than Russia is. And given the kind of the cultural proximity between Russia and Ukraine, it's scary to Putin to have this illustration of an effective democracy right next door, because that certainly is not what it's like in Russia.
You're working on the ground. Have you been observing the last days any human rights violations happening?
Well, yes. I mean, there was just, I guess, a day and a half, 2 days ago now, there was intense shelling from the Russian-backed forces, which hit actually a kindergarten and a residential area. And that, it was a big deal because it happened right now. It has not been that atypical for the way the conflict in the Donbass has been fought. And there has been, widespread indiscriminate shelling and the like. And so that has been a long-standing concern of Human Rights Watch in the far eastern region of the Ukraine, which has been at war now for years. Our fear, of course, is that this will be replicated across Ukraine if Russia invades. And the other reason that gives us concern is if you just look at how Russian forces have operated in Idlib province in northwestern Syria, where Human Rights Watch recently issued a report showing that Russian bombers were deliberately targeting hospitals, schools, markets, apartment buildings. I mean, they're with the aim of making Idlib unlivable to make it easier for Syrian ground forces to move in, push out all the civilians. If they, treat Ukraine that way, it'll be a disaster.
What do you do in these cases as a Human Rights Watch? Do you keep on observing daily reports? How do you work on the ground?
Yeah.
Because we all also want to understand how's you're working with the researchers on the ground, on the operative level.
Well, obviously, our bread and butter is to, get to the scene of the crime. So let's say there's a bombing. Ideally, we go there. We talk to the people who were eyewitnesses. The first thing you have to figure out was there a legitimate military target there? Because the mere fact that a bomb lands someplace is not automatically a war crime. You've got to look at the circumstances. But if you can determine there was no legitimate military target, or even if there was, that the civilian consequences were known to be disproportionate, that gives you evidence of a possible war crime. We then publish as quickly as possible, because our aim is not just to describe, our aim is to change the conduct.
And you mentioned you look according certain criteria. What are the criteria where you say it is a war crime, it is not a war crime?
Oh, well, the standards that we apply are basically the Geneva Conventions, so-called international humanitarian law. And the rules are quite simple. You cannot, deliberately target civilians. You have to only aim at military targets. You cannot use means that are indiscriminate. You've got to fire, at the military target, not just like paper a whole area with shells.
Yeah.
And even if you're aiming at a military target, you've got to make sure that the consequences to civilians are not disproportionate compared to the definite military advantage that you would want to secure. So those are the basic rules. They're well established. Nobody really quarrels with those rules. We then apply them.
If we, the example maybe you mentioned is a bit more clear than others when we're talking about Syria or when you mentioned Ukraine, but you also have some struggles or areas where it's not so clear. So how you try to keep being impartial and to know what's really happening, because sometimes this is very important for you to keep your credibility.
Oh, no, we have to be right. We have to be absolutely accurate.
Everyone wants to be right, but how can you assure you're right?
Well, we assure, in the sense, we have our investigators on the ground, and we have a certain luxury, which is to say, if we're not sure, we don't publish. We only publish when we know that we're right. We don't have to comment on everything. We just comment on the things that we can establish. And so we don't claim to be comprehensive, but we try to be, look at a kind of a representative sampling and report on the things where we can say definitively, this is what happened. Okay. That it is a war crime or it's not a war crime. We will call it either way.
You're operating in more than 90 countries.
Yes.
And you have a lot of researchers and field researchers working on the ground. How do you ensure their security? Because they are living in countries where human rights are being violated, freedom of press is being suppressed, but nevertheless they're taking a risk to work on the ground. How do you protect them?
Well, obviously there's never a 100% guarantee, but the protection of our staff is a huge concern for us. We have, a staff devoted to the security of our staff, and we don't do that by running around with, Uzi machine guns protecting people. We do it by, paying attention to the information we have about the threats to them and trying to keep them away from those threats. So, sometimes if you have to travel in a war zone, there are questions about what time of day, whom do you travel with, what kind of communications you have, who are you checking with on the ground. So there are a number of practical steps. We also have a certain advantage in the sense that we're not, say, the war photographers. We don't have to be at the scene of the crime. We can talk to somebody who was there and get their account. And that gives us a degree of distance and hence safety as well.
If we, in order to understand it more, what are now for you today, for Human Rights Watch, the top 3 locations where you say, we have to look there. There should be something done.
Well, look, I can't just name 3 because, as you know, we're working in like nearly 100 countries.
I know,
but look, we just heard today from the Chinese foreign minister who was completely denying the mass detention and persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. That's an enormous crime against humanity. We've got to deal with that. We're very concerned with the Tigray region of Ethiopia, where the actual fighting seems to have been dying down. There were clearly war crimes on both sides, but the Ethiopian government has been largely blockading the delivery of humanitarian and medical aid to this region, where there are millions of people who are in desperate need.
Yeah.
We're also deeply concerned about say the military juntas that are operating in Myanmar and now Sudan. And even within Europe, which is not quite as dire, but we're concerned about just the state of democracy in the European Union. And both Hungary and Poland are really challenging the idea that the European Union is a club of democracies. If they get their way, it's just going to be a trading bloc.
What's your main concern in Europe? You mentioned Poland and Hungary, but what's making you feel insecure towards that it might not support democracy?
Well, both Orban in Hungary and Kaczynski, who's the effective ruler in Poland, are deliberately trying to undermine the checks and balances on executive authority. They're attacking the media, they're attacking civil society, they're attacking the independent judiciary, and the aim is to allow them unfettered latitude in how they rule. That is not democracy. Democracy has checks and balances, it has a government that is accountable to the voters, and that's not the vision of the current Hungarian and Polish governments. Now, the European Union has a tool to counter that, and it's financial. They can condition their massive subsidies to Hungary and Poland on respect for human rights, the rule of law.
But according
democracy.
to what I know, they didn't do it.
They have not done it yet.
Yes.
But the European Court of Justice just ruled last week that they can. And so now the ball is in the court of the European Commission of Ursula von der Leyen. And I hope she acts expeditiously. She has not
What do
been
you
out
expect?
there.
Will she? Will they?
She's been looking for excuses not to act, but those excuses are now disappearing. And so it is, I think, time to start holding hearings to demonstrate, through a factual record that democracy is being undermined, and then to start imposing sanctions if there's not movement. Now, already there has been withholding of the COVID recovery funds. And I was just in Poland, and that is being felt quite urgently. And indeed, the Polish government has now made a couple of concessions with respect to its efforts to undermine the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, because of that financial pressure. So the financial pressure works. It's just a matter of applying it consistently.
You talk about financial pressure. I heard you today asking Chancellor Olaf Scholz about does Germany also put a condition when they are doing international deals, business deals, economical deals. You took an example, China.
Yeah.
And were you satisfied with his answer?
I wasn't. I have to say, my question to him basically was Germany has a reputation of allowing its considerable business interests to undermine the consistency of its defense of human rights. And China was one of the examples I noted. Now, there have been parts of the German government that have been great. I mean, at the UN in New York, for example, they've been very helpful in spotlighting Xinjiang. But Angela Merkel, as in her last year as chancellor, in fact, at the point a year plus ago where Germany held the presidency of the European Union, Chancellor Merkel was taking the lead in negotiating an investment deal with China.
China, yeah.
And everybody knew you couldn't have an investment deal at the same time as the Chinese government is using large-scale forced labor of Uyghur Muslims. And so rather than saying no deal unless you stop the forced labor, rather than saying, okay, at least no deal unless you ratify the treaty against forced labor, Merkel settled for no treaty unless you think about maybe sometimes down the road perhaps ratifying that treaty. It was a complete nothing. And sadly, Chancellor Scholz now kind of defended that approach.
So what's your answer to him?
If Germany is going to live by the principles that it claims that it abides by, then there should be no investment deal if that means complicity in the large-scale use of forced labor of Uyghur Muslims in China, period. They shouldn't stand behind some promise to ratify a treaty. They should insist on its end.
Sometimes you wish that they don't do it. Nevertheless, governments or world leaders or presidents keep on doing and saying we also take care for human rights, but we have to do our business. How do you deal with that in the moment? Is it that disappointing for you? What do you think then?
Well, many governments do that. The German government is particularly notorious for saying we're going to put business first. And the only way to counter that is to spotlight what's going on. And so we did this with the investment deal with respect to China. We did it where Angela Merkel also was pretty weak on Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Hungary in imposing conditionality with respect to the disbursement of EU funds on stopping his attacks on democracy. We're worried today with respect to Russia that Germany is so dependent on Russian oil and gas that it may weaken its ability to sort of uphold human rights within Russia, where they are on a steep decline back toward Soviet-era repression.
You mentioned China and about the investments that happens, but also when you look at China, I don't know if are you following the Olympic Winter Games?
Of course, yeah.
And what's your thought about what's happening, that it's happening there in China while the Uyghur Muslims are being suppressed, are being attacked?
Yeah, I mean, it's utterly inappropriate that the Olympics are held there at the moment when the Chinese government is committing crimes against humanity, against against millions of Uyghur. What's interesting is the Chinese government, basically threatened retaliation against any athlete who protested. So there was like one Norwegian speed skater who went back to Norway and protested, but basically everybody else has been afraid. But just the other day, a Chinese spokesperson used an Olympic press conference to start denying that there were atrocities against the Uyghur. And what's amazing is the International Olympic Committee, which can see no evil when it comes to Chinese abuses, even they felt the need to protest, because here's China saying, never talk about politics in the context of the Olympics, and then uses an Olympic press conference to lie, to deny reality about its mistreatment of Uyghurs.
I would go to a quote that you said, and comparing what we talked about till now in our interview. You said that autocratic leaders are facing now significant backlash in 2021. Right. When I listen to what you said now, then I'm not optimistic the way you are in this sentence.
Well, let me explain why I said that. If you look back over the past year or year plus, there has been, first of all, an outpouring of public support for democracy. You see massive protests for democracy in Hong Kong, Thailand, Myanmar, Russia, Belarus, Uganda, Nicaragua, Cuba. I mean, I could go on.
Yeah.
In many countries, when people, tire of autocratic rule, they stand up for democracy, even at the risk of being detained or killed. So if you're sitting and if you're an autocrat, you look like people are against me. Then the other interesting trend over the last year is that classically autocrats would manipulate elections in order to stay in power. They would hold an election, but they would, censor the media a little bit or disqualify a candidate here, do things to tip the playing field enough so that they could win. And what we've seen just really in the last year has been that autocrats no longer trust even manipulated elections. They need complete electoral charades. And so Putin just did that with the Duma elections in Russia. Lukashenko did that in Belarus.
They are still
Ortega
there.
did it in
That's what I mean.
They are still there. But what has happened in the process is they've lost the ability to confer, for the election to confer any legitimacy. Because an electoral charade, a zombie election, does not confer legitimacy. And so yes, they're still there, but they're there purely by virtue of force, not in any sense to be able to claim that the people want them. Now, they can hang on, but that is not a long-term solution, because ultimately, even dictators have to have some degree of consent from the people. So I just think if you put yourself in the shoes of the autocrat, it's a challenging environment out there. It is not a friendly environment. Yeah, they may hang on, but they all are running scared.
What has changed? Does digitalization play a role? There are new ways of expressing opinion, connecting worldwide together. What has changed that they must be more afraid?
Well, I mean, obviously social media gives people an opportunity to communicate and to organize and the like. It also gives governments an opportunity to spread propaganda. So
yes.
It cuts both ways. But I think, the bottom line is that, the autocrats claimed, democracy, it's too messy, too many checks and balances, too slow. Democrats don't deliver. Trust us autocrats, we'll deliver. So people have given them a few years. And what they see is the autocrats deliver for themselves. They deliver for their cronies. They're corrupt, they're repressive, they don't serve the people. And this has actually come to the fore during the pandemic, where you see, the autocrats are much more interested in censoring critics than they are in really addressing the pandemic. And people have had it. They see through all these lies and pretenses of autocratic rule. They just want rid of these people. So, when will they succeed? Who knows? I can't predict that.
Yeah.
But the tide is turning against the autocrats.
My last question is, what would be your message, your main message to the world leaders? And we have some who are participating and still participating here in the Munich Security Conference. What's your core message?
Yeah, I mean, the core message is that it's a mistake to think of human rights as kind of a nice little side issue that we'll get to when we have time. That if you look at the big issues of the world, including the huge security issues that are being confronted here in Munich, human rights, if you have governments that respect human rights, you are much more likely to get rid of these security threats. The security threats tend to emanate from unaccountable dictators who are serving themselves, not what their people want.
Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy your stay here in Munich. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.